How are you doing? This is Britain in Depth, and what you're looking at on the screen right now is David Lammy. And honestly, what he's defending at this moment isn't just a policy adjustment, it's something that goes straight to the heart of Britain's constitutional protections. We're talking about trial by jury, a principle that has been a backbone of the British justice system for centuries. Now the government appears to be quietly diluting that principle under the banner of efficiency. In a moment, I'm going to show you the part of Parliament where the opposition begins to dissect Lammy's argument in forensic detail, using actual numbers to demonstrate that this isn't simply about court backlogs. Watch carefully, because if the right to jury trial is weakened today, tomorrow the entire standard of fairness in the justice system can start to shift. Let's listen.
Let us be the Parliament that chose to act. Let us be the Parliament that turned the tide. Let us be the Parliament that restored swift and fair justice to this country. I urge the House to support this bill, and so I beg to move the bill is now read a second time.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the Shadow Lord Chancellor Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today, the government attacks an ancient English right that runs through our Constitution, from Magna Carta to the Bill of Rights to trials taking place at this very moment in courts across the land. That right, that nobody should be seized or imprisoned or deprived of his standing in any way except by the lawful judgment of his equals, is an essential part of our national inheritance. It's part of what makes our legal system the envy of the world. It's admired by jurists and legislators from all around, and it's been copied by all those countries, success stories like America and Australia, that have followed our common law model.
That was a very important point right there. When he talks about common law traditions and constitutional principles, he's reminding the Chamber that these ideas didn't just shape the UK, they influenced legal systems across the world. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a reminder of the level of protection that the concept of trial by jury represents. Now let's continue, because he's about to start dissecting the government's efficiency argument.
But this government, I will make some progress first, but this government, without a mandate, without a case, without any evidence to justify its actions, has decided our ancient rights are little more than an inconvenience. I will make some progress first. An inconvenience that this Justice Secretary thinks he can sweep away with only the briefest consideration. And why? The Justice Secretary says this is about efficiency and protecting the rule of law. But that is nonsense. According to the government's own impact assessment, reducing jury trials will cut the Crown Court workload by around 3.5%. But even that number, as I will explain, is wrong. According to the Institute for Government, this bill will reduce the Crown Court workload by only 1 or 2%. In other words, rape victims who are waiting for a year for their case to be heard at present would have their cases heard just 1 week earlier.
And this is where the numbers begin to change the entire picture. If the government's own impact assessment suggests that the workload reduction would be around 1 or 2%, and victims would see hearings brought forward by roughly a week, then a very obvious question emerges. Why is such a significant constitutional change being proposed for such a small operational gain? At that point, the issue starts to look less like efficiency and more like power and control. But watch what happens next, because another MP is about to make a point that might genuinely surprise you.
Just in a moment. And there is, from the basics, like getting defendants to court on time to intensive case management, much more that can be done to make the courts more efficient without attacking jury trials. I will give way.
Honourable Member, if since writing his speech he has seen the updated information that has been available around the percentage that it will reduce in our courts.
The Institute for Government has made absolutely clear that the figures that the government has produced are based on assumptions that are not necessarily shared by anybody who knows, what we're talking about. I will give way to the honourable member.
Thank the member for giving way. Would he agree that legal judgment by peers or equals can include legal judgment by magistrates, and that indeed there is no ancient right to jury trial? To say so is to misrepresent the case.
I think it's important to pause here for a moment because a claim was just made that could easily confuse viewers. Magistrates absolutely play a role within the justice system. But when we're talking about serious criminal cases, the principle of trial by jury has traditionally been a central pillar of public confidence. Why? Because the jury represents community judgment, ordinary citizens acting as a check on the power of the state. When you start reducing the role of juries, you're not simply changing a procedure, you're changing the balance between the citizen and the state. And here's the key point. If the government genuinely had a clear solution to the backlog crisis, we would expect to see reforms focused on court resources, case management, scheduling efficiency, and process improvements. Instead, the focus appears to be on altering one of the most fundamental protections within the system itself. Let's return to the debate because the next speech goes directly after the efficiency argument.
Magistrates have their place in the system, but jury trials are fundamental to our inheritance and to public confidence in the criminal justice system. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, if the reason is not efficiency, why is the government doing this? There are only two plausible explanations. The first, that this left-wing government, determined to censor free speech, indifferent to public concern about two-tier justice, simply wants to do away with the hassle of juries. The second, that this is something the civil service has long sought to do, but after a line of wiser secretaries of state than this one, they finally found a minister foolish enough to go along with it. You can imagine the scene in the Ministry of Justice. A reshuffle is underway. The Cabinet Secretary tips off Sir Humphrey, who promptly gathers his officials, asking them what the new Justice Secretary is all about. A private secretary plays the now notorious episode of Celebrity Mastermind. What blue cheese is paired with port, asks the quizmaster. Red Leicester, says the honourable gentleman. Sir Humphrey's eyebrow arches. Which Marie won the Nobel Prize for Physics? Antoinette, comes the answer. Sir Humphrey smiles a wry smile. Which English king followed Henry VIII? Henry VII, cries the right honourable gentleman. Sir Humphrey looks around to his trusted officials. Finally, he says, I think this time we found our man. For this is not a new idea, Mr. Speaker. Officials have been itching to do this for years, but wiser secretaries of state have always said no. By this explanation of events, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Justice Secretary accepted the advice of his officials, failed to interrogate their arguments, and without so much as a second thought, decided to do what was rejected even during the pandemic, when lockdown and social distancing rules meant criminal trials were postponed. I will give way.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. I appreciate that he is into storytelling, maybe his next job. But what did he think was going to happen to the court system when there was a 23% cut under the last government? It was going to crumble. Does he not agree?
Crown Court waiting times were actually lower under the Conservatives until the pandemic. And it is true. It is true that the backlog grew. It is true that the backlog grew during the pandemic. The pandemic came before the general election. Why was this measure, if it was so necessary, not in the Labour Party manifesto? I am willing, Madam Deputy Speaker, to accept that this account might be unfair. Despite all the evidence provided by the Justice Secretary over the years, the policy might not be explained by his incompetence. Just as plausible is ideological vandalism, and we should take ministers at their word. Yeah. To be clear, I don't mean the occasions when the Justice Secretary insisted, quotes, criminal trials without juries are a bad idea. Yeah. No, I mean the explanation given by the Minister for courts. She says this is ideological. Yeah. Asked if the government would be doing this for reasons other than efficiency, she said yes. And if you join the dots, this does make sense. Because Labour governments have tried to do this before. In 1999, 2003, and in 2007. And of course, the Right Honourable Gentleman says Margaret Thatcher did this. That is not only not true, and if he reads the Downing Street years, he will get a lesson in conviction politics and strong leadership, which this government does not understand. I will not give way.
What you've just heard really comes down to one central idea. This is not a narrow admin tweak. It's a constitutional direction of travel question. Yes, the government keeps framing this as a response to backlogs, but the argument you just heard in Parliament exposes the weak point in that story. If the projected reduction in workload is only around 1 to 2%, then the policy being proposed is wildly disproportionate to the benefit being promised. When the gain is that small, you have to ask why the government is willing to touch something as foundational as jury trials at all. And that becomes even more important when you remember the second warning that was raised. This isn't the first attempt. The House was reminded that similar efforts have appeared before in 1999, 2003 and 2007. That matters because it suggests this idea isn't an emergency measure that suddenly became necessary in 2026. It looks more like a recurring project that returns whenever political conditions allow it. Now, there are two key things the public should understand, and if you take nothing else from this video, take these. First, trial by jury is not just a format for hearings, it's a safeguard. It exists to make sure the state cannot decide a citizen's fate purely through institutional convenience or closed decision-making. A jury injects ordinary public judgment into a process that otherwise becomes dominated by professionals, procedures and incentives that ordinary people never see. That doesn't mean juries are perfect, but it does mean they carry something the system cannot manufacture: public legitimacy. When people believe justice is being done by a process that includes people like them, they trust the outcome more. And when trust collapses, the rule of law becomes weaker no matter what the statute book says. A jury also acts as a practical check. It forces the prosecution case to make sense to normal citizens, not just to lawyers who live inside legal language every day. It challenges assumptions. It scrutinises narratives. It creates friction. And in justice, friction is sometimes the point, because speed without safeguards is how mistakes become routine. Second, if the real goal is to reduce delays, there are obvious routes that don't require shrinking jury trials. Backlogs are usually driven by capacity and process. Not enough courtrooms, not enough judges, not enough staff, inefficient case progression, late disclosure, hearings that collapse, scheduling problems, and weak pre-trial management. Governments can expand resources, modernise listing systems, improve digital case management, tighten timelines, and strengthen early-stage review so weak cases don't drag on for months. These are the boring solutions, but they are the honest solutions. So when the policy spotlight shifts away from those practical fixes and lands on reducing juries, it's natural for the public to start asking, what is the real objective here? Not because you need to assume a conspiracy, but because in a democracy, when the state seeks more streamlined power, citizens are entitled to demand a higher standard of justification. That's why today's exchange in Parliament matters. Because it wasn't challenged with vibes or slogans, it was challenged with figures, impact assessments and measurable outcomes, and with the bigger question of confidence in the criminal justice system. If the improvement is marginal but the constitutional cost is permanent, then the burden of proof is on the government to explain why this is necessary. And this shouldn't be viewed purely through a partisan lens. This goes beyond left versus right. It goes to the relationship between the citizen and the state and how much protection the individual retains when power wants faster outcomes. Because if jury trials are weakened today, it sets a precedent. Other elements of due process can be presented tomorrow as inefficient too. So the real question is this: do you believe this bill will genuinely solve the backlog problem, or is it the first step in a larger shift in how British justice is decided? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. This is Britain in Depth. If you value this kind of forensic breakdown, subscribe and share, because awareness is always the first line of defence.